And it really is important to remember it is a genuine and absolute conquest. It is precisely what Putin is trying to do at the moment in the Ukraine, and it's done with similar violence. It's also done, of course, with a similar doctrine of history and the claim that William is the appointed heir of Edward the Confessor, and so on. Exactly the same thing. Shock and awe tactics on the one hand, William's working, Putin's not so well, combined with a careful manipulation of propaganda and history, real or pseudo, or I think actually in both cases an intriguing mixture of the two. But what happens in with 1066 is on a scale I think which not even Putin would attempt, though a Stalin would have done. There is simply a complete decapitation of England, in the sense that not simply is the king killed, not simply is Harold killed at Hastings, an entire ruling class, the ruling class of the lay nobility, and very quickly of the clergy, if you like, the intelligentsia, are wiped out. So you decapitate Anglo-Saxon England. And this is of profound importance. You destroy a whole particular kind of aristocratic tradition. The questions that Dr. Gelmo is interested in, like ideas of kingship and whatever, you wipe out the elite, which of course had been, if you like, the custodian of those ideas. But you do something else. Anglo-Saxon, you actually change language. So you decapitate England, you remove its upper class, you remove its intelligentsia, and you reduce the population to prose, simply to a subordinated class. A little later, a few decades later, once, as it were, the re-emergence of the English had happened, you get somebody like William of Malmesbury, who's of English descent himself, saying it had been a shame to be an Englishman. You were a conquered people. Conquest destroys all previous rights. The law of conquest was entirely clear at this period of time. If you conquer a country, its entire existing system of law is at your mercy, and its entire population is at your mercy. All their possessions are at your mercy. And William the Conqueror did not have very much mercy. So you decapitate a country and you destroy its written culture. Many Anglo-Saxon, or comparatively significant numbers of Anglo-Saxon books do survive. But what happened was Anglo-Saxon England had been very peculiar in the European context, in that the language of the church, the language of administration, and the language of politics had been the vernacular. It had been the popular language. It had been the Germanic dialect of Anglo-Saxon. Latin was known, of course, but it wasn't, as it were, the official language, the official chronicle of Anglo-Saxon England, the most important text of which was at Peterborough Abbey, was kept in Anglo-Saxon. And it was it's extraordinarily beautiful script, modelled on the Carolingian script, so it's very much easier to read to our eye. It's much closer to modern letter type forms than most medieval handwriting. It's extraordinarily beautiful script, and it's a very complex language, like German. It's got declensions. It's got elaborately conjugated verbs and so on. It's got agreement. Between nouns and adjectives. All of that. In other words, it's the language whose elaborate rules need a literate, educated caste to keep it going. They've been decapitated. They go. Because not only does John remove the English aristocracy, either directly or because they rebel against his rule, also you get the complete restructuring under Lanfranc, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the complete restructuring of the English church, an extensive move of sees from one place to another, and the building, of course, of these gigantic cathedrals, the great Norman cathedrals, which rest so heavily on England, which of course is also combined with the characteristic feature of military occupation, which is the introduction of castles, first wooden castles and then the stone castles. England, in other words, is a country with an oppressed helot population, with a foreign ruling caste speaking a different language, and with this linguistic transformation, so that Anglo-Saxon, rather than being the national language in the modern sense, and the language of both high culture and of administration and of popular speech, Anglo-Saxon degenerates into, I suppose, peasant grunts. And you have three languages, what's left of Anglo-Saxon, progressively losing its grammar and its structure. Then you have French, which is the language of the Norman nobility who are imposed on England, and those English who managed to marry or worm their way into it becomes in other words, French becomes the language of politics, of culture, of polite discourse, of the developing novels and romances and poetry of the time. And then finally, all high administration and the church itself is conducted in Latin. So you shift from a monoglot culture to a trilingual, one language culture, to a trilingual structure, language structure, with enormous consequences. And from that, of course, emerges, centuries later, the end of the 14th century, the new language of English. Really, it's a very new language. It only goes back to about 1400. It's still only about 600 years old. Very new indeed, peculiarly so. So all of that, these gigantic changes, some things don't change, of course. What is very striking is that the basic unit of English government, which is the county, the shire, the Normans keep. There's no attempt at changing that. And indeed, I think the way in which William insists on, not as it were parcelling out the lands of the English in solid blocks, say, corresponding to counties, to his barons, but scattering their lands over, admittedly, very large quantities over the whole country, actually reinforces the importance of the shire as a unit of both local and national administration. So that continues with very important consequences. The general quality of the English coinage, which had been such a remarkable feature of Anglo-Saxon England, is sort of preserved, though it becomes actually very, very much less well managed under the Normans than it had been under the Anglo-Saxons. So the view that you're replacing a primitive culture with a sophisticated culture really seems to me not to be on at all. And then the bigger questions. Well, there is this period under William, particularly after the revolt of the North, the imposition of the foreign law, the forest laws and so on, and the whole thing reaching a culmination in the reign of William Rufus, that you do genuinely have a situation, I suppose it is actually quite analogous to South Africa in the age of apartheid. You have an elite, a foreign elite, an elite that has invaded and has conquered and has taken over, and a suppressed, oppressed population treated with contempt and subject to special discriminatory laws, the legalization of reprisals in return for murder. If a Norman was murdered by the Anglo-Saxon oppressed population in an area, there was an organised system of monstrous reprisal and so on. All of that. But with the death, the murder, the death in mysterious circumstances of William Rufus, there is a beginnings of a very distinct shift. You get You get his brother Henry, who seizes the throne, beginning with the Anglo-Saxon capital at Winchester, where the treasury was, and so on. When he goes out of his way to reabsorb something of the Anglo-Saxon tradition. He marries a descendant of the Anglo-Saxon royal house, a child of King David of Scotland. So you get the incorporation into the royal line of Anglo-Saxon blood. He even gives his first son, his eldest son, the lad who dies and drowned in the wreck of the White Ship. He even gives him a joint Anglo-Norman name, Norman Anglo-Saxon name. He's William the Atheling, the child of high-born descent, of noble, of royal descent. So there is, and again, as I said, in this period of the early 12th century, you get the way in which the culture diversifies, in which Englishmen, trained of course now in the new resources of Latin and the remarkable Latin of what's called the 12th century Renaissance, start to reappraise their own history, and reappraise the history and write extraordinarily good history. William of Malmesbury is probably the best historian in England until Thomas More, one would reckon, or perhaps the author, somebody that I may have time to talk about later in this Q&A session, the author of the continuation of the Croyland Chronicle, very, very sophisticated. So you're beginning by within whatever it is, 3 generations of the Norman conquest, you're beginning to get more of a cultural fusion, more of the Anglo-Saxon inheritance to be self-consciously incorporated into the Norman. And it may be that something of that sense of a different attitude to kingship, the notion of kingship being a collective responsibility rather than simply the will of one man, the powerfully absolutist tradition exemplified by William. You may be getting something of that surviving, because after all, even William himself had consciously had himself crowned in Westminster Abbey, the great church built by Edward the Confessor. He had invoked the laws of Edward the Confessor. He had insisted that he was Edward the Confessor's legitimate heir. So all of that, despite the obliteration, the destruction, as I said, the decapitation, what we would describe as a form of cultural genocide. That word seems to me to be entirely appropriate. The destruction of a written language and culture. Despite all of that, much clearly does survive. But it's refracted, it's transformed, it's overlaid, and above all, it's filtered through different languages, different styles of politics, different values, and very, very different people. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.
To our channel.